The galaxy always whispered that humanity was forged in the relentless fires of a broken, unforgiving world. The wider interstellar community called them Deathworlders, brutes, scavengers. We believed their heavily calloused hands were only capable of tearing things apart, built for brutal war and industrial slaughter. So, when the primary fusion reactor on station Aegis 7 breached and the evacuation klaxons screamed their final warning, we left our most precious cargo behind a jammed titanium bulkhead, weeping for our doomed children. We returned 3 days later to collect their tiny, frozen bodies. We never expected to find a miracle. The disaster did not announce itself with an explosion, but with a horrifying, absolute silence. On station Aegis 7, a joint diplomatic and research facility orbiting the gas giant Tantalus, Standard Cycle 440 began like any other. The station was a beacon of the new alliance between the newly integrated United Earth Directorate and the long-established Lyran Concord. The Lyrans, an elegant, deeply communal species with a physiology reminiscent of Earth's most delicate crystalline structures intertwined with mammalian grace, had agreed to cohabit the station to study deep space atmospheric harvesting. Winston, the chief diplomatic envoy for the Lyrans, was reviewing atmospheric yield charts when the station's artificial gravity gave a sickening lurch. His translation matrix, permanently embedded near his auditory canals to facilitate communication with his human counterparts, crackled with static. Then came the red emergency lights. They bathed the pristine white corridors in the color of human blood. Hull fracture, Sector 4. The automated PA system announced, its voice devoid of the panic that instantly gripped Winston's heart. Catastrophic pressure loss detected. Reactor containment failing. Immediate station-wide evacuation protocol initiated. Sector 4, the residential ring, the nursery. Winston dropped his datapad and sprinted. His long, slender legs carried him gracefully over the vibrating deck plates, but fear made him clumsy. Ahead of him, the heavy titanium blast doors designed by human engineers to compartmentalize disasters were already beginning their slow, inevitable descent. Eleanor, his mate and the station's lead astrobiologist, was already at the Sector 4 junction. She was pounding her delicate, four-fingered fists against the reinforced glass of the viewport. On the other side of the descending bulkhead was the nursery ward, where their 3 newborn infants rested in the highly specialized environmental incubators. Lyran infants were born dangerously premature by human standards. They required a constant temperature of exactly 32. 5 degrees Celsius, specifics, atmospheric pressure, and the simulated rhythmic thumping of a mother's dual heartbeat to regulate their own fragile nervous systems. Without the incubators, they would perish in less than 2 hours. "The doors!" Eleanor screamed, her voice breaking through the translation matrix in a harrowing wail of absolute despair. "Winston, the system locked the doors. The breach is on the far side of the ward. Override it," Winston yelled, frantically typing codes into the bulkhead control panel. "Computer, authorize Lyran Envoy Winston. Override code Epsilon Niner. Access denied. Containment protocol active." The door was a foot from the floor. Through the narrow gap, Winston saw a pair of heavy, steel-toed work boots sprint into the corridor on the inside of the sealed zone. It was Thomas Sterling, the human senior maintenance chief. Thomas was a massive man, standing 6'4", built like a brick wall, usually covered in engine grease, and possessing a loud, booming laugh that always made the delicate Lyrans flinch. Thomas slid on his knees, his grease-stained coveralls scraping against the deck, trying to jam his massive hydraulic wrench under the descending door to stop it. The titanium groaned, the hydraulic motor screaming in protest, but the human-engineered safety protocols were relentless. The door crushed the wrench handle, forcing Thomas to pull his hands back just before they were severed. The door hit the floor with a final, resonant boom. The seal hissed tight. "Thomas!" Winston screamed through the intercom. "Thomas!" "Our children are in Ward B, the incubators." Static filtered through the speaker. Thomas's voice came back, strained and breathless. Winston, the outer hull in the adjacent lab just blew. Life support is dropping on this side. I'm locked in the corridor with the nursery. The evacuation pods are leaving. A Lyran security officer, Silas, grabbed Winston's arm. Envoy, the reactor is going critical. If we do not leave for the escape shuttles now, we will vaporize with the station. I am not leaving my children, Eleanor shrieked, fighting against Silas's grip with a ferocity Winston had never seen. They are already gone, Eleanor, Silas said, his own voice thick with grief. The power to Sector 4 has been severed by the containment protocol. The incubators are dead. The temperature will drop to absolute zero in a matter of hours. We have to go. Winston looked through the reinforced glass. On the other side, Thomas was standing up, looking at the blinking red lights of the sealed nursery door. The human looked back at the viewport, meeting Winston's eyes. There was terror there, but also a grim, hardened resolve that Winston couldn't comprehend. Go! Thomas's voice barked over the intercom, the audio clipping. Get on the damn pods, Winston. Go! Silas dragged them both away. As they fled toward the docking bay, the station shaking violently around them, Winston's mind went entirely numb. He imagined the cold creeping into the nursery. He imagined his fragile infants, their skin turning pale, their tiny, unformed lungs seizing in the freezing dark. And he imagined the massive, clumsy human trapped alongside them, likely panicking, perhaps suffocating as the oxygen scrubbers failed. Humans were survivors, brutish and selfish in their instinct to live. Thomas would tear the sector apart looking for a way out, completely ignoring the dying infants in the next room. They piled into the escape shuttle just as the station's primary tethers snapped. As they shot out into the dark void of space, Winston held his sobbing mate, watching the lights of Aegis 7 flicker and die, plunging the station into an eternal, frozen night. 3 days. It took 3 agonizing, silent days for the United Earth Directorate to dispatch the heavy cruiser, Dauntless, to recover the remains of Aegis 7. The Dauntless was a warship refitted for disaster recovery, commanded by Captain Harrison, a stoic human veteran with graying hair and eyes that had seen too many ruined colonies. Winston and Eleanor stood on the bridge of the cruiser, wrapped in thermal blankets, staring at the main view screen. Aegis 7 hung in the void like a fractured skeleton. The reactor hadn't detonated, but it had entirely melted down, venting its plasma into space and leaving the station completely dead. Frost coated the exterior windows. There were no lights, no heat signatures. It was a tomb. I am deeply sorry, Envoy Winston, Captain Harrison said, his voice a low rumbling baritone. He stood beside the Lyran couple, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. Our long-range scans show 0 thermal output from Sector 4. The ambient temperature inside that module is currently resting at minus 180 degrees Celsius. Eleanor let out a soft, broken keen and leaned against Winston. Silas, standing nearby, crossed his arms. His grief had hardened into a bitter, cold anger. Your engineering failed us, Captain. The blast doors locked us out. They condemned our young to freeze. The blast doors contained the breach, Silas, Harrison replied evenly, not rising to the bait. If they hadn't dropped, the atmosphere of the entire station would have been violently vented into space. You would not have made it to the escape pods. It was a brutal protocol, but it saved 73 lives and took 4, Winston whispered. My 3 children. And your chief engineer. Harrison's jaw tightened. Thomas Sterling was one of the toughest men I've ever known. He survived the orbital strikes on Mars during the insurrection, but no one survives 3 days in a vacuum without a thermal suit. We are launching the boarding shuttles now. We will recover the bodies. Your family will have their proper rights. The tension on the ship was palpable. The Lyrans viewed the humans with a mixture of awe and underlying disdain. Humans were tough, yes. They were from Earth, a planet that routinely tried to kill its inhabitants with tectonic violence, extreme weather, and apex predators. Because of this, human technology was built like them. heavy, resilient, but utterly lacking in nuances. They didn't understand fragility. As the boarding party suited up in the airlock, Winston insisted on accompanying them. It is highly irregular, envoy. Dr. Abigail Miller, the Dauntless's chief medical officer, gently warned him as she helped him seal his heavily insulated environmental suit. The internal conditions are gruesome: zero gravity, absolute cold. There will be floating debris, and the physiological state of the deceased will be traumatic to witness. "They are my children, Doctor," Winston replied, his voice flat and uncompromising. "I will carry them out of the dark myself." Dr. Miller nodded sympathetically, securing his helmet. Captain Harrison, armed with a heavy plasma cutter, led the team of 6 Marines and Silas into the umbilical breach tunnel. The airlock hissed as they connected to the dead station. When the doors pried open, the harsh beams of their shoulder-mounted flashlights cut through a haze of floating, crystallized water vapor. The silence inside the station was absolute, deafening in its intensity. Without the hum of life support, the vibration of the deck plates, or the rush of air through the vents, the station felt like a massive, floating coffin. Gravity plating is dead, mag boots on. Harrison ordered over the comms. They walked in heavy, synchronized thuds along the wall. The destruction was staggering. The walls were scorched, panels ripped away, exposing dead wiring that hung like severed veins. As they moved deeper towards Sector 4, they began to see the frantic, desperate signs of Thomas Sterling's final hours. "Look here." Silas pointed his light to the ruptured wall panel. The emergency life support scrubbers had been violently torn out. The heavy bolts had been sheared off by sheer physical force. The human panicked. He ripped the atmospheric recyclers from the wall. Further down the corridor, they found an empty emergency oxygen tank. The valve had been snapped off. Beside it lay Thomas's heavy work belt, coated in frozen droplets of dark red blood. Winston felt a surge of bile in his throat. The narrative was painting itself clearly in his mind, the terrifying brute strength of a Deathworlder. Thomas had realized the air was running out and the temperature was dropping. He had frantically torn the corridor apart, breaking machinery, hoarding whatever oxygen he could find, injuring himself in his feral panic. He suffered. Dr. Miller noted quietly, shining her light on the frozen blood. "That's a lot of blood loss." Probably tore his hands up, trying to manually bypass the secondary bulkheads. He was an animal trapped in a cage. Silas muttered darkly. He probably tore through the nursery looking for emergency supplies. "Enough!" Harrison snapped, though his voice betrayed a deep sorrow. "Sterling was a good man. Don't dishonor the dead before we know the facts." They finally reached the entrance to the Sector 4 nursery. The heavy door was there, but it was altered. Wires had been haphazardly pulled from the ceilings and spliced directly into the door's manual override junction. Spark burns scarred the metal. "He bypassed the lock," Silas said, his voice tight. He went into the nursery. Why? There was nothing in there but the incubators. Winston closed his eyes inside his helmet. The incubators had backup microbatteries, enough power to run a comms unit. Or perhaps, in the mind of a panicked human, enough power to jury-rig a personal heater. The thought of the massive engineer violently tearing the incubators apart to save himself made Winston's heart ache with a profound, consuming hatred. "Captain." One of the Marines spoke up, checking a handheld scanner. "I'm getting a localized anomaly. Must be on this door. It's faint, but there's a residual heat signature and a microatmosphere." Harrison frowned, looking at his own wrist monitor. "That's impossible. Sector 4 has been dark for 72 hours. Cut the door." Sparks showered the frozen corridor as the plasma cutter bit into the titanium. The silence was broken by the agonizing shriek of melting metal. It took 10 agonizing minutes to cut through the heavy locking mechanism. With a heavy kick from Harrison, the door drifted inward, bouncing off the interior wall in the zero gravity. The boarding party raised their weapons and flashlights, sweeping the room. What they saw froze them in their tracks. The nursery was completely unrecognizable. It looked less like a state-of-the-art medical facility and more like a primitive, scavenged nest built in the heart of a war zone. The entire room was dark, save for the faint, warm amber glow of a single emergency work light suspended from the ceiling. Every single thermal blanket on the ward had been stripped from the storage closets. They had been layered, taped, and tied together using heavy electrical wire, creating a thick, insulated tent in the dead center of the room. The ambient air in the corridor was 180 degrees, but inside the nursery, the frost stopped entirely at the edge of that makeshift tent. Atmospheric pressure inside the tent is stable, the Marine whispered, her voice trembling. Oxygen levels are low, carbon dioxide is high, but it's breathable. Temperature inside the enclosure is 32 degrees. Winston's breath hitched. 32 degrees? Move up slowly, Harrison ordered, stepping into the room. They approached the tent. The outside was lined with the gutted remains of the emergency scrubbers they had seen in the hallway. Someone had painstakingly rewired the chemical oxygen generators, routing them through a stripped-down water filtration tube to create a crude but functional humidifier. Dozens of small, drained micro-batteries harvested from comms panels, data pads, and flashlights were wired in a terrifyingly complex daisy chain to a central heating coil salvaged from a sterilization unit. Harrison reached out with his thick, gloved hand and gently pulled back the heavy flap of the thermal tent. The beam of his flashlight pierced the gloom, and Winston gasped, falling to his knees as his mag boots disengaged. Inside the tent, lying against the far wall, was Thomas Sterling. The massive human was completely stripped of his heavy environmental suit and his upper clothing. He wore only his base layer pants. His bare chest and arms were a tapestry of horrific, frostbitten skin and deep, jagged lacerations. His right hand was completely mangled, wrapped in bloody gauze, evidently crushed when he had fought the blast doors 3 days ago. His lips were blue, his skin pale and slick, with a freezing sweat. He was shivering violently, his eyes closed. His breathing incredibly shallow and ragged, but it wasn't Thomas's injuries that caused Dr. Miller to drop her medical scanner. Strapped securely to Thomas's massive, bare chest, held in place by torn strips of his own uniform, were the 3 Lyran infants. They were not in their incubators. The incubators sat in the corner, dark and dead. Their primary power cells carefully extracted and added to the daisy chain powering the heating coil. Instead, Thomas had turned his own body into the incubator. The infants were nestled against his skin, absorbing the immense natural body heat that a 200 human generated. But human heat wasn't enough. Lyran infants needed the specific rhythmic thumping of a mother's dual heartbeat. Winston, tears streaming down his face, crawled closer. He realized Thomas wasn't just shivering. The massive engineer was tapping. Even in his semi-conscious, near-comatose state, Thomas's uninjured left hand was resting softly over the infants. His thick, calloused fingers were drumming a steady, relentless rhythm against his own chest. Thump, thump, pause, thump, thump. He was manually simulating the Lyran dual heartbeat. For 3 days, without sleep, without food, bleeding and freezing, and from Thomas's cracked, blue lips came a sound, a low, gravelly hum. It was a rugged, old earth song, a lullaby pushed through vocal cords that were desperately fighting for oxygen. The deep vibration of his voice resonated through his chest cavity, providing the exact acoustic frequency the fragile infants needed to remain calm. As the light hit his face, Thomas's eyes fluttered open. They were bloodshot, dazed, and clouded with extreme hypothermia. He blinked against the harsh light, his head rolling slightly toward the boarding party. When he saw the heavily armored figures, his first instinct wasn't relief. It was fierce, instinctual protection. His massive left arm instantly curled tight around the 3 tiny crystalline infants. He let out a weak, guttural growl, his teeth bared in a primal display of defense, looking exactly like the terrifying apex predator the galaxy believed humans to be. "Whoa, whoa, easy there, Chief," Captain Harrison said, his voice cracking with intense emotion. He immediately switched off his flashlight and dropped to his knees, taking off his helmet so Thomas could see his face. "It's me, Tom. It's Harrison." "Stand down, soldier. We're here." Thomas blinked, the aggressive haze slowly clearing from his eyes. He looked at Harrison, then his gaze shifted to Winston, who was sobbing uncontrollably just outside the tent. Thomas's rigid finally broke. A faint, exhausted smile touched his cracked lips. "Envoy." Thomas wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. He slowly, painfully uncurled his arm. They're hungry. Didn't have the formula." Winston scrambled forward, stripping off his heavy gloves, uncaring of the cold. He reached out and touched his children. They were warm. Their skin was a healthy, vibrant, translucent pink. They were fast asleep, completely unaware of the apocalypse that had raged around them, lulled into safety by the heartbeat of a Deathworlder. "You!" Winston choked out, looking up at the massive, broken human. "You saved them. You gave them your air, your heat." "It's what we do," Thomas murmured, his eyes drifting shut as his body finally allowed the adrenaline to fade. "Kids come first, always. Get the medevac stretchers in here right now." Dr. Miller screamed into her comms, rushing forward and pressing a stim injector into Thomas's neck. "He's in severe hypovolemic shock and profound hypothermia. Move, move, move." As the Marines rushed in, Silas stood frozen at the entrance of the tent. The Lyran security chief, who had spent the last 3 days cursing human brutality, stared at the massive engineer. He looked at the torn, bloody hands that had ripped apart steel not out of panic, but to harvest the parts needed to keep 3 alien babies warm. He looked at the brute strength that had been channeled entirely into the gentlest, most agonizingly careful act of endurance he had ever witnessed. "I need help lifting him," Dr. Miller yelled. "He's too heavy." Silas didn't hesitate. He dropped his weapon, stepped into the makeshift nest, and put his hands under the shoulders of the human. The med bay of the UED Dauntless was a symphony of controlled chaos. The heavy, pressurized doors slid shut, sealing out the silent corridors of the ship, and locking the medical team in a desperate race against physics and failing biology. Dr. Abigail Miller stood at the center of the storm. On the primary surgical table lay Thomas Sterling, his massive frame dwarfing the sterile white surface. The emergency lighting cast harsh shadows over his frostbitten skin, illuminating the mottled purple and black patches that threatened deep tissue necrosis. "Core temperature is resting at 26 degrees C and dropping," an automated voice chimed from the overhead monitors. "Patient is entering profound ventricular fibrillation. Get him on the Stryker thermal regulation circuit now." Dr. Miller barked, ripping open a sterile pack of intravenous lines. "We need to warm his blood externally. If we just throw heat lamps on him, the cold, acidic blood pooled in his extremities will rush back to his heart and kill him instantly. I need 2 Baxter rapid infusers running heated saline, maximum flow rate." Just beyond the reinforced glass of the surgical suite, Winston's and Eleanor stood paralyzed. Eleanor was clutching a smaller portable UED incubator where their 3 infants had been hurriedly placed. The babies were safe, their crystalline skin glowing a healthy, translucent pink, completely ignorant of the frantic battle occurring just feet away. Silas stood behind the Lyran couple, his posture rigid. The Lyran security chief watched the human doctors with a heavy, unblinking gaze. He had spent his entire career operating under the assumption human medicine was as brutal and unrefined as their military tactics. Yet, what he saw was a highly orchestrated, desperate ballet of preservation. "Doctor," a nurse yelled, his hands slick with surgical gel as he pressed defibrillator paddles to Thomas's chest. "We're losing the rhythm. The hypothermia has severely damaged the myocardium. He's crashing." A long, shrill, continuous tone pierced the room. The heart monitor flatlined. Winston pressed his delicate forefinger hand against the glass. "No," he whispered, his translation matrix barely picking up the sound. "After all of that, no." Inside the suite, Dr. Miller didn't flinch. "Charge to 200J clear." Thomas's massive chest arched off the table with a violent spasm, but the monitor remained a flat, unforgiving red line. His heart muscle is too cold to respond to electrical stimulus. Dr. Miller gritted her teeth, her hands flying over a tray of specialized UED military-grade stimulants. We have to jumpstart the central nervous system first. Push 3 milligrams of epinephrine and get the Medtronic extracorporeal membrane oxygenation ECMO system online. We are bypassing his heart and lungs entirely. We will pump his blood for him until he thaws. Suddenly, a secondary alarm began to wail. It wasn't coming from Thomas's monitors. It was coming from the portable incubator in Eleanor's arms. The 3 Lyran infants were shifting violently. Their skin, previously a calm pink, was rapidly flushing to an agitated dark crimson. Their tiny mouths opened, emitting a high-pitched harmonic distress frequency that made the glass of the medbay vibrate. "What is happening?" Eleanor cried out, nearly dropping the incubator. The atmospheric mix is correct. The temperature is exactly 32.5 degrees. Why are they destabilizing? Dr. Miller looked up from the surgical table, her eyes wide. The acoustics, she realized aloud. Lyran infants need the mother's dual heartbeat to regulate their autonomic nervous system. The incubator's synthetic thumper is running. They are rejecting it, Winston said, panic seizing his chest. It is too perfect, too mechanical. For 3 days, they were conditioned to the irregular, heavy thumping of the human's chest and his voice. The incubator's rhythm is alien to them now. Silas didn't wait for permission. He slammed his fist into the medical suite's intercom button. "Dr. Miller, the infants require the human's auditory signature. They need his heartbeat or their nervous systems will collapse from the shock of the transition." Dr. Miller looked at the flatlining monitor above Thomas, then at the frantic Lyrans. "He doesn't have a heartbeat right now, Silas. We're manually pumping his blood." "Then use what you have." Silas roared back, his usual diplomatic restraint shattering. "The audio logs, the internal comms from your rescue helmets, play it back." Captain Harrison, who had been standing quietly in the corner of the observation deck, immediately tapped his wrist console. He pulled the audio feed from his boarding suit's memory drive, the exact recording of the moment they had opened the thermal tent. He patched the audio directly into the portable incubator's internal speakers. Through the tiny speakers, the sterile hum of the medical bay was suddenly replaced by a heavy, exhausted, gravelly sound. Thump, thump, pause. Thump, thump. It was the sound of Thomas Sterling's thick fingers drumming weakly against his own chest, accompanied by the low, strained, breathless humming of an old earth lullaby. Almost instantly, the infants stopped thrashing. The dark crimson faded back to a soft pink. They curled together, leaning toward the source of the audio, their breathing synchronizing with the ghost of the human's rhythm. Inside the suite, Dr. Miller had successfully engaged the Medtronic ECMO circuit. Thick, dark blood was being pulled from Thomas's femoral artery, run through a machine that warmed and oxygenated it, and pushed back into his body. "We have mechanical circulation." Dr. Miller exhaled, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Core temp is rising to 28 degrees. He's not out of the woods, but we've stopped the descent." Winston sank to his knees on the observation deck, weeping silently. Silas placed a hand on the envoy's shoulder. The security chief looked at the UED captain. "Captain Harrison," Silas spoke softly, the anger entirely gone from his voice. "I formally retract my previous statements regarding human engineering. Your machines are keeping him alive, but your people are something else entirely." 4 days later, UED Ambassador Gwendolyn Hayes sat at the head of a polished obsidian table in the diplomatic wing of the Dauntless. Across from her sat Director Arthur, a senior representative of the Lyran High Council, flanked by his aides. The mood in the room was exceptionally tense. The disaster at Aegis 7 was a political powder keg. The Lyran Council was demanding answers for the loss of the station, and there were already whispers in the Lyran press attempting to blame the structural failure on crude, substandard human industrial design. "Ambassador Hayes," Director Arthur began, his voice smooth but laced with sharp condescension. While we acknowledge the surprising resilience of your maintenance chief in preserving Envoy Winston's offspring, we cannot ignore the broader catastrophe. The station's primary reactor housing was designed by your engineers. The blast doors, which callously trapped Liran personnel and caused the deaths of several researchers, were human-coded protocols. Gwendolyn, a seasoned diplomat with sharp features and a completely unreadable expression, calmly folded her hands on the table. Director Arthur, the blast doors did not fail, Gwendolyn stated evenly. They operated exactly as designed. They compartmentalized the breach and prevented explosive decompression from ripping through the residential ring. They trapped my people, Arthur countered, his crystalline crest flaring in agitation. Allow me to present the final telemetry data recovered from Aegis 7's black box, Gwendolyn said, tapping a command onto the holographic projector in the center of the table. I believe this will clear up any misconceptions regarding the sequence of events. A glowing blue wireframe of the station appeared in the air. At 0800 hours, a microfracture occurred in the external atmospheric harvester, Liran technology, I might add. The resulting pressure wave ruptured a UED coolant line, leading to the reactor meltdown. The station's automated systems initiated lockdown. She highlighted Sector 4 in the nursery ward. When the alarm sounded, Chief Engineer Thomas Sterling was in Sector 3. He was completely clear of the blast zone. He had a direct, unobstructed path to escape Pot Bay A. The Liran aides leaned in, watching the data stream. Instead of evacuating, Gwendolyn continued. Chief Sterling accessed the internal security feeds. He saw that the automated blast doors were descending in Sector 4, and he saw that Envoy Winston's children were on the wrong side. The hologram shifted, showing a red dot representing Thomas moving rapidly toward the danger zone. He sprinted into Sector 4 just as the primary containment doors sealed. But that is not the most crucial piece of data. Gwendolyn paused, looking directly into Director Arthur's eyes. Director, do you know why the reactor plasma didn't incinerate the nursery? Arthur frowned. The containment fields held. No, Gwendolyn corrected softly. The containment fields failed almost immediately. The plasma flooded the umbilical corridor leading directly to the nursery. The only way to stop the fire from reaching the ward was to manually engage the heavy emergency bulkhead at junction point Delta. Gwendolyn brought up a video feed from a damaged security camera. It was grainy and silent. It showed Thomas Sterling, massive and covered in grease, standing at junction point Delta. On one side of him was the open corridor leading to the escape pods. On the other side was the nursery. The automated system was trying to close the bulkhead, but a piece of debris had jammed the tracks. The video showed Thomas violently kicking the debris free, but the automated motor had burned out. The door wouldn't close on its own. Thomas looked down the hall toward the escape pods. Then he looked at the nursery. Without hesitation, the massive human stepped inside the doomed corridor alongside the nursery, grabbed the heavy manual override wheel, and put his back into it. His muscles bulged, tearing his coveralls as he physically dragged the massive titanium bulkhead closed from the inside, sealing himself in the dead zone with the incubators. He didn't get trapped by our safety protocols, Director Arthur, Gwendolyn said, her voice echoing in the silent room. He intentionally trapped himself. He manually sealed the bulkhead to save the nursery, knowing full well it meant cutting off his only exit. He traded his life for theirs 3 days before he ever built that thermal tent. Director Arthur stared at the frozen holographic image of the human, his jaw slightly open. The condescension was entirely wiped from his face, replaced by a profound, humbling shock. 2 decks below, in the intensive care unit, the lights were kept dim. Winston sat in a chair beside the surgical bed, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of Thomas Sterling's chest. The UED medical team had worked miracles. Thomas was breathing on his own again. His right hand was heavily bandaged. Dr. Miller had been forced to amputate 2 fingers that had been crushed beyond repair by the blast doors. A low groan emanated from the bed. Thomas shifted, his eyelids fluttering before slowly opening. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, blinking away the heavy narcotic haze. He slowly turned his head and saw Winston. Thomas's voice was completely shot, sounding like dry leaves crushed under boots. Envoy. Winston immediately stood up, his throat tight. He poured a small cup of water and held the straw to Thomas's cracked lips. The human drank greedily, coughing slightly. "Where are they?" Thomas wheezed, his left hand instinctively twitching toward his own chest, searching for the weight of the infants. "They are safe, Thomas," Winston whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "They are sleeping in the ward next door. They are perfectly healthy. You saved them." Thomas closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of immense relief. He let his head sink back into the pillow. "Good, that's good." Winston looked at the heavily bandaged stump of Thomas's right hand. "Thomas, the High Council has reviewed the data. We know what you did at the Bulkhead. You gave up your escape. You sacrificed your own body to become their Hearth. Why? We are alien to you. We called your kind brutes." Thomas opened his eyes and looked at the Lyran envoy. Despite the exhaustion and the pain, a small, genuine smile touched the human's lips. "My granddad used to tell me stories." Thomas rasped quietly, said humanity spent thousands of years fighting each other over dirt and invisible lines, said we were selfish. But he also said, "You really find out what a human is made of when you put a defenseless kid in front of a fire." Thomas looked away, staring at the soft pulse of his heart monitor. "It doesn't matter what planet you're from, Winston. A baby is a baby. In the dark, we don't leave the little ones behind. We just don't." Winston reached out, taking Thomas's uninjured left hand in both of his delicate, 4-fingered hands, pressing it gently to his forehead in the highest Lyran gesture of absolute reverence and eternal debt. "You are a brute no longer, Thomas Sterling," Winston vowed softly. "You are a guardian of Lyra, forever." The footage did not stay confined to the polished obsidian tables of the diplomatic wing. Within 72 hours, the unedited telemetry data, alongside the silent, grainy security feed of Thomas Sterling dragging the junction bulkhead closed, was leaked to the Lyran deep space communication buoys. The political fallout was instantaneous, but it did not manifest as the United Earth Directorate had feared. There were no riots demanding human expulsion from the sector. There were no fiery speeches in the Lyran High Council condemning human engineering. Instead, a profound, stunned silence fell over the Lyran Concord. For decades, the standard Lyran educational curriculum had painted humans as a necessary hazard. They were classified as an aggressive, high-gravity species, useful for their unmatched industrial output and their terrifyingly effective military, but fundamentally incompatible with the delicate, harmonious philosophies of the wider galaxy. Then came the image of the brute in the dark, the sight of a massive, heavily scarred human, a creature who possessed the raw kinetic strength to manually bend titanium, stripping himself bare in absolute zero conditions to incubate fragile alien infants, shattered a century of prejudice. Lyran sociologists coined a new phrase overnight, the apex paradox, the terrifying realization that a species evolved to survive the most violent planet in the known galaxy had developed an equally violent, uncompromising instinct to protect the helpless. On Earth, the response was entirely different. The news of Aegis 7 dominated the global feeds. For a population still bearing the generational scars of the Mars insurrections and the resource wars, Thomas Sterling became an involuntary icon of redemption. "We are not just the monsters under the bed anymore," Secretary General David Brooks announced during a globally televised address from Geneva. Chief Sterling has shown the stars what we have always known about ourselves. Our hands are heavy, yes, but they are heavy so they can bear the weight of those who cannot stand. While the galaxy reeled from the socio-political shockwave, the reality of the event was playing out in agonizing, localized detail within the sterile confines of the dauntless medical bay. Thomas did not experience a miraculous sci-fi recovery. Human biology was resilient, but it exacted a heavy toll for survival. The frostbite on his chest and arms eventually healed into stark, pale scars that mapped the exact placement of the 3 Lyran infants. But the damage to his right hand was permanent. Despite Dr. Abigail Miller's best efforts, the microvascular structures in his ring and pinky fingers had completely collapsed from the crushing force of the blast doors. They had been amputated at the second knuckle. "Phantom pain is to be expected, Chief," Dr. Miller said quietly, adjusting the dosage on his localized analgesic pump. It was week 3 of his recovery. Thomas was sitting up, staring blankly at the heavily bandaged stump. The brain still expects the sensory input. It will take time to remap. "I can still feel the cold metal," Thomas murmured, his voice still carrying the raspy gravel of oxygen deprivation. He didn't look up. "Every time I close my eyes, I feel the door slipping. I feel the ice. You did it, Tom." The door stayed shut. Dr. Miller placed a warm hand on his shoulder. "You need to focus on the aftermath, not the descent. Speaking of which, Envoy Winston's lead pediatrician forwarded me the latest biometric data on the children." Thomas finally looked up, a spark of genuine interest cutting through the heavy narcotic haze. "Are they all right? Did the atmospheric mix stunt their crystalline growth?" Dr. Miller smiled, pulling up a holographic chart. "They are more than all right. In fact, they are exhibiting an entirely unprecedented physiological anomaly. Lyran infants typically have a resting heart rate of roughly 140 beats per minute, highly susceptible to environmental stress. The 3 infants you incubated, their resting rate has stabilized at 90 beats per minute." Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing. "Is that dangerous?" "No," Dr. Miller said, her smile widening. "It's an adaptation. For 3 days, their developing autonomic nervous systems were forced to synchronize with your heavy, slow mammalian heartbeat to survive. Your rhythm became their baseline. Their biorhythms are now deeply rooted in human physiological timing. They are calmer. They process stress hormones far more efficiently than standard Lyran children. Tom, your heartbeat literally rewired them to be stronger." Thomas leaned back against his pillows, staring at the ceiling of the med bay. The weight of his own actions was finally beginning to settle over him, not as a nightmare of ice and failing air, but as something permanent, something deeply, fundamentally connective. 8 months passed. The frozen wreckage of Station Aegis 7 was towed into the local star and incinerated, a final funeral pyre for the tragedy. Thomas Sterling was medically discharged from active fleet maintenance. He was given a full UED pension, the Star of Terra for extreme valor, and a quiet, single-story home on the outskirts of Neo-Denver, Earth. He spent his days adapting to his modified prosthetic hand, watching the snow fall over the Rocky Mountains, and trying to avoid the relentless requests from interstellar news outlets. He thought his part in the galactic theater was over. He was a retired grease monkey with a bad hand and a loud chest. That assumption shattered on a crisp Tuesday morning when a sleek, silver Lyran diplomatic shuttle broke through the Earth's atmospheres and silently touched down on the snow-covered landing pad of the Neo-Denver spaceport. Thomas was waiting on the tarmac, wearing a heavy wool coat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The ramp lowered and Envoy Winston emerged, flanked by his mate, Eleanor, and the ever-stoic Silas. The Lyrans looked slightly uncomfortable in the heavy, localized gravity of Earth. Their movements a fraction slower, their crystalline crests wrapped in thick thermal scarves. But as Winston saw Thomas, The envoy's face broke into a radiant expression of pure joy. Winston did not offer a formal diplomatic bow. Instead, he stepped forward and pulled the massive human into a fierce, surprisingly strong embrace. "Thomas," Winston breathed, stepping back and holding the human by his broad shoulders. "It is entirely too cold on this planet of yours." Thomas let out a booming laugh, the sound echoing across the frosty tarmac. "I warned you. Winston, we like our winters harsh. Keeps us honest." Eleanor stepped forward, pushing a specialized, hover-assisted UED stroller. She smiled warmly at Thomas. Inside the insulated canopy sat 3 Lyran toddlers. Due to their species' rapid early developmental cycle, they were roughly the equivalent of human 2-year-olds. Their skin was a flawless, iridescent pearl, and their large, dark eyes took in the falling snow with wide, silent wonder. Winston had named them Arthur, Beatrice, and Silas. "They have been incredibly fussy the entire voyage," Eleanor confessed, her translation matrix picking up a maternal sigh of exhaustion. "The ship's atmospheric compensators hum at a frequency that irritates them." Thomas slowly went down on one knee, ignoring the sharp ache in his joints. He peered into the stroller. 3 pairs of dark alien eyes immediately locked onto him. He didn't speak. He reached out with his left hand, his good hand, and rested it gently against the edge of the stroller. Then he began to tap his fingers against the metal frame. Thump, thump, pause. Thump, thump. It was a quiet sound, barely audible over the wind sweeping across the spaceport, but the reaction was instantaneous. Little Beatrice, who had been chewing anxiously on the collar of her thermal suit, stopped. Her crystalline crest flushed a soft, happy pink. Arthur let out a small, trilling chirp, and Silas, the smallest of the 3, reached out with his delicate 4-fingered hand and grabbed Thomas's massive, calloused thumb. Thomas felt a sudden, fierce lump form in his throat. He let out a low, gravelly hum, the exact same old Earth lullaby he had forced through his frozen vocal cords in the dark of Aegis 7. The toddlers immediately leaned forward, pressing themselves against the side of the stroller closest to Thomas, their eyes fluttering shut as the deep acoustic resonance of his chest washed over them. The nervous energy completely bled out of them, replaced by a profound, absolute peace. Silas, the Lyran security chief, watched the interaction from a few paces back. He looked at Ambassador Gwendolyn Hayes, who had accompanied the human escort. "Ambassador," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a monumental shift in galactic policy, "the High Council has ratified the new defense accords. As of yesterday, the Lyran Concord has formally requested that the United Earth Directorate take over the primary security and emergency response protocols for our entire outer colony ring." Gwendolyn raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "That is a massive concession of sovereignty, Commander Silas. Your people have never allowed a foreign military presence in the outer ring. We do not view you as a foreign military anymore." "Ambassador," Silas replied, his eyes fixed firmly on the massive human kneeling in the snow, surrounded by sleeping alien children. "We view you as our Hearth guardians. The galaxy is a dark, freezing void. We have finally realized who we want standing between us and the cold." Thomas stood up, carefully wiping a stray tear from his eye before the wind could freeze it. He looked at Winston. "So," Thomas said, clearing his throat and trying to mask the overwhelming emotion in his voice, "I hear you guys are sticking around Earth for a few weeks to finalize the treaties. You need a guide. Someone to show you the sights?" Winston smiled, an expression of profound, unbreakable kinship. "We would be honored, Thomas, though I must insist you carry Silas. He refuses to sleep unless he is pressed directly against your sternum." Thomas laughed, reaching down to unbuckle the small Lyran toddler. "Come here, you little crystal gremlin," he muttered affectionately, lifting the child with practiced, terrifyingly gentle ease and resting him against his chest. "I've got you." 5 years after the Aegis 7 disaster, the United Earth Directorate had fully integrated into the Lyran Concord's defensive and emergency infrastructure. The galaxy had grown accustomed to the sight of heavy, brutalist human cruisers flying in formation alongside the elegant crystalline Lyran solar skiffs. Humanity had found its purpose not as conquerors, but as the galaxy's premier disaster response force. Thomas Sterling, his gray hair now fully white, had settled into his role as a senior civilian advisor to the UED Outer Rim Command. He spent most of his time on the Lyran core worlds, walking with a slight limp, but carrying the immense unspoken respect of an entire alien civilization. Arthur, Beatrice, and Silas, the 3 infants he had saved, were now the equivalent of human adolescents, towering over him in their delicate, translucent grace, yet still insisting on greeting him by pressing their hands against his chest to feel his heartbeat. It was a golden age of peace, and then the universe reminded them all that it was inherently hostile. The crisis did not come from a structural failure or a warring faction. It came from the cosmic dark. A rogue, high-velocity brown dwarf, a dead star completely undetectable by standard Lyran optical sensors, until it was too late, intersected the Kaylen system. Its massive gravitational pull acted like a cosmic tether, violently dragging Kaylen Prime, the Lyran Concord's primary nursery world, entirely out of its habitable zone. In the UED command center on Earth, Admiral Harrison stared at the holographic projection of the system, his face grim. Beside him stood senior analyst Sarah Jenkins, her fingers flying across the tactical displays. "The orbital shift is catastrophic, Admiral," Sarah reported, her voice tight. Kaylen Prime's surface temperature is dropping by 10 degrees C every hour. In 48 hours, the oceans will freeze solid. In 72, the atmosphere will begin to liquefy and rain down as liquid nitrogen. Thomas, standing at the edge of the holotable, felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. The nursery vaults. Kaylen Prime houses over 2 million Lyran infants in the subterranean maturation complexes. They rely on geothermal heat. The tectonic shift caused by the brown dwarf has ruptured the geothermal vents, Sarah confirmed, bringing up a cross-section of the planet. The vaults are losing power. Lyran evacuation transports are far too fragile to enter the atmosphere. The extreme thermal shear winds are tearing their crystalline hulls apart in the upper stratosphere. They are trapped. The room fell dead silent. 2 million infants. The scale of the tragedy was unimaginable. It was Aegis 7 multiplied by 1,000,000. Admiral, a communications officer, called out, "We have Envoy Winston on the subspace channel. He is currently on Kaylen Prime, inside Vault Alpha." The main screen flickered to life. Winston looked haggard. His usually vibrant crystalline crest was dull, his skin pale. Behind him, the massive cavern of Vault Alpha was chaotic. Millions of emergency lights bathed the endless rows of incubators in a sickly red glow. "Admiral Harrison. Thomas." Winston's voice crackled through the static of the dying atmosphere. "The ambient temperature is failing. Our engineers estimate we have less than 6 hours before the incubators exhaust their microbatteries. The High Council has authorized a protocol of selective triage. We are to preserve the genetic samples and accept the loss of the population." Thomas slammed his prosthetic hand onto the holotable, the metal ringing sharply through the command center. "Like hell you are," Thomas roared, his gravelly voice echoing with the same kinetic fury that had ripped the blast doors apart 5 years ago. "We don't do triage on kids, Winston. We don't leave them in the dark." "Thomas, there is no choice," Winston wept openly, his translation matrix picking up the raw agony in his throat. "Your ships cannot evacuate 2 million infants in 6 hours. It is physically impossible." "We aren't going to evacuate them," Admiral Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. He looked at Sarah Jenkins. "Captain, mobilize the entire heavy-lift fleet. I want every deep-core mining vessel, every terraforming rig, and every heavy infantry dropship fueled and launched in 20 minutes. "Sir?" Sarah blinked. "Those ships aren't meant for medical transport. They don't have the life support for Lyran biology." "We aren't bringing the Lyrans up, Jenkins," Harrison replied, his eyes locked on Kaylen Prime's dying projection. We are taking Earth down to them. The sky above Kaylen Prime did not simply freeze. It shattered into a kaleidoscope of lethal, jagged geometry. The Lyran solar skiffs that usually danced in the upper stratosphere. They were massive, ugly, scarred blocks of tungsten, titanium, and depleted uranium. They were deep-core mining rigs, terraforming haulers, and heavy infantry dropships, built specifically to withstand the crushing pressures of gas giants and the hellish heat of active volcanic worlds. They punched through the storms by sheer, unapologetic brute force. Their heavy heat shields glowed a blinding white, shedding continuous streams of ionized plasma that briefly illuminated the freezing, dying world below. Inside the lead dropship, Thomas Sterling gripped the overhead railing, his prosthetic hand locking into place as the hull groaned under the immense atmospheric pressure. Liquid nitrogen rain battered the reinforced viewports like heavy artillery fire. Altitude 10,000 meters, Sarah Jenkins shouted over the deafening roar of the descent engines. The air density is spiking. Surface temperature is currently 210 degrees. If we land too hard, the impact tremors will shatter the vault ceilings, kill the main thrusters. We drop in free fall and burn retro rockets at 500 meters. Admiral Harrison barked from the command chair. It was a suicide maneuver, a drop tactic used only by orbital shock troopers, but it was the only way to bypass the worst of the thermal shear winds without ripping the fleet apart. The sudden weightlessness was nauseating. For 10 agonizing seconds, thousands of heavily armored UED ships plummeted like stones through the freezing dark. Then, the retro rockets fired. The sudden deceleration slammed Thomas into his crash webbing, his teeth rattling. Outside, the heavy dropships slammed onto the frozen crust of Kaylen Prime, their massive hydraulic landing struts absorbing the impact. "Deploy the breaching mechs!" Thomas roared into the comms, instantly unbuckling his harness. They poured out of the dropships into an absolute nightmare. The ground was slick with solidifying gases. Before them stood the entrance to Vault Alpha, a pair of massive reinforced crystalline doors. But the tectonic shifts had buckled the frame, and a thick layer of solid nitrogen had sealed the doors completely shut. Winston, watching from the inside through a secondary security feed, felt his heart plummet. The incubators were flashing their final, desperate red warnings. The microbatteries were dead. On the surface, Thomas didn't hesitate. The mechs can't get traction on the ice. O'Connor, bring up the localized thermal charges. We blow the hinges. Chief, if we blow the hinges, the concussive wave might collapse the entry tunnel. Major O'Connor, a heavily scarred combat engineer, yelled over the screaming wind. If we don't, 2 million kids freeze in the next 10 minutes. Set the charges, Thomas ordered. The explosion was deafening, sending a massive geyser of pulverized ice into the black sky. The heavy crystalline doors groaned, fractured, and violently gave way, collapsing outward. Through the swirling frost and smoke stepped Thomas Sterling, wrapped in a heavy class, a thermal suit. Behind him poured thousands of human personnel. They were military engineers, off-duty medics, roughneck miners from the asteroid belt, and civilian volunteers. They carried massive portable fusion reactors strapped to their backs, the kind used to forcefully thaw permafrost on dead, lightless moons. "Drop the reactors at the junction points," Thomas bellowed, his voice amplified across the cavernous, panic-stricken vault. "I want overlapping thermal fields. Jenkins, get the atmospheric scrubbers running. We need to balance the oxygen-carbon mix immediately." The humans moved with a terrifying, synchronized aggression that left the Lyran caretakers paralyzed in awe. They slammed the heavy reactors onto the stone deck plates, hastily splicing thick, insulated UED power cables directly into the delicate Lyran crystalline power grids. Sparks showered the vault as they forced the brute force human energy into the alien system. Within minutes, a wave of intense, dry heat washed over the freezing vault. The temperature gauge on Winston's datapad spiked from 30 degrees to a warm 25 degrees C. Winston let out a sob of relief, rushing forward to embrace Thomas. "You did it, Thomas. You brought the sun to the underworld." But the relief lasted exactly 4 seconds. The twist of fate did not come from the cold, but from the fundamental incompatibility of their two worlds. Human technology was loud, crude, and aggressively powerful. Lyran technology was delicate, harmonic, and precise. A loud, ear-piercing whine suddenly echoed from the primary junction box. "Chief!" O'Connor screamed, staring at his diagnostic tablet. The Lyran grid can't handle the raw amperage. The fusion output is completely overwhelming their crystalline conduits. Before Thomas could order a shutdown, the main junction exploded in a shower of blue sparks. An electromagnetic surge cascaded through Vault Alpha. The heavy UED reactors instantly safety-locked, their heat dying out. Worse, the surge fried the delicate circuitry of every single incubator in the cavern. The red emergency lights on the pods didn't just flicker, they died entirely. The artificial thumping of the mechanical heartbeats ceased. Absolute, terrifying silence fell over the vault, followed a second later by the harmonic, glass-shattering shrieks of 2 million Lyran infants going into immediate, simultaneous nervous system collapse. Their skin, briefly warmed, immediately flushed a deathly pale blue. "No, no, no." Winston fell to his knees, clutching his head. "The batteries are fried. The thermal coils are melted. The ambient heat is already dissipating. We killed them. We tried to save them with fire. And we burned their only shelters." Thomas stared at the dead incubators. The ambient temperature was plummeting back toward 0. He looked down at his own heavily scarred right hand, remembering the agonizing freezing dark of Aegis 7. He remembered what had actually kept those 3 babies alive. It wasn't the broken heater, it was him. "The machines are dead," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly calm that cut through the panic. He reached up and unlatched the heavy collar of his thermal suit. "So we stop using machines." He hit the general broadcast button on his chest rig, syncing to every human in the vault and to the millions of others currently breaching the other vaults across Kaylen Prime. "All UED personnel," Thomas commanded. "The tech has failed. We are initiating the Hearth protocol. Strip your thermal gear. Form perimeters around the incubator blocks, skin to skin, people. Give them your heat. Give them your pulse. Do it now." For a fraction of a second, the Lyran caretakers didn't understand, but the humans did. Thousands of massive, battle-hardened Marines, miners, and engineers immediately unlatched their heavy armor. They threw their insulated coats onto the freezing deck, ignoring the biting cold of the subterranean cavern. Wearing only their thin base layers, they climbed directly into the massive dead incubator arrays. Thomas walked to the center of the vault. He stripped off his heavy coat and his thermal shirt. The frigid air bit viciously into his old frostbite scars, but he didn't flinch. He sat on the freezing deck. Silas, the Lyran adolescent named after his rescuer, immediately understood. Weeping silently, Silas began pulling the freezing blue infants from the dead pods and handing them to the humans. He handed 3 to Thomas. The massive human pulled the tiny, fragile alien lives against his bare, scarred chest. He closed his eyes, fighting the immediate, violent shiver of his own body. Then, he began to tap his good left hand against his sternum. Thump, thump. Pause. Thump, thump. Beside him, Admiral Harrison, sitting cross-legged on the ice-cold stone with a lap full of infants, picked up the rhythm. He tapped his collarbone. Thump, thump. Pause. Thump, thump. Sarah Jenkins joined in. Then O'Connor. The rhythm spread like wildfire. Thousands of humans, stripped bare in the freezing dark, began to drum their chests in perfect unison. The immense acoustic resonance of thousands of heavy, slow human heartbeats filled the cavern. It reverberated through the metal deck plates, bouncing off the stone walls, creating a physical living wave of deep, rhythmic bass. Then came the humming, low, gravelly, exhausted voices bleeding together, thousands of human voices blending into a wordless, rumbling lullaby, drowning out the shrieking winds of the apocalypse raging miles above them. The deathly blue hue of the Lyran infants instantly faded, nestled against the burning natural furnaces of human bodies, absorbing the deep acoustic thumping of mammalian hearts. Millions of them closed their eyes and went to sleep. It was an agonizing endurance. For 48 hours, the UED held the line. They did not sleep. They did not eat. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers as the ambient temperature remained brutally low, but their core temperatures, fueled by UED stim packs administered by frantic Lyran medics, burned hot enough to keep the infants alive. They sat in the dark, drumming their chests until their knuckles bled, singing until their vocal cords tore. They turned an entire dying planet into a living, breathing nest. When the rogue brown dwarf finally passed and Kaylen Prime's orbit was stabilized, the surface of the world was a dead, frozen wasteland. But beneath the ice, in the deep dark, 2 million tiny hearts beat in perfect, synchronized harmony with the heavy, stubborn pulse of humanity. The universe is a cold, indifferent expanse, an endless night that seeks to extinguish the fragile light of life. For millennia, the interstellar community believed that survival required clinical detachment and cold logic. They looked at humanity, a species born from earthquakes, blizzards, and predators, and saw only violence. They expected our calloused hands to bring war. Instead, we brought the fire. The legacy of Aegis 7 and Kaylen Prime rewrote the stars. We are no longer the Deathworlders, feared for our dense bones and kinetic fury. We are the Hearth Guardians. When the ice encroaches and the reactors fail, when the delicate species of the galaxy find themselves staring into the freezing dark, they no longer pray to distant deities. They broadcast a distress signal. They listen for the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a human heart, knowing that the brutes of Earth will never leave the little ones behind.